2022 marked a widespread return of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! After 2 pandemic-affected years had previously grounded the scene to a halt. Since it's December, we'll be ranking and going over the top 10 TCG decks of 2022. Though before we get started with the list, I'd like to give an honorable mention to the P.U.N.K, Bystial, and Runick archetypes, which were widely used as secondary engines and tech options throughout the formats. They had a huge impact on those roles, but didn't quite accomplish enough as a core strategy on their own to make this list. And with that out of the way, let's get started. And starting this list at number 10, we have Lyrilusc Tri-Brigade, also known as Bird Up. Lyrilusc are level 1 Wing Beast archetype revolving around swarming the field with special summons and mass searching out of the deck to create powerful Xyz monsters, like number F0 Utopic Draco Future and Lyrilusc and Blue Robin. This is in most part possible thanks to its powerful extender in the form of Lyrilusc Recycling Starling, an Xyz monster that can search any level 1 Wing Beast on an effect that is not a hard once per turn. Meaning you could make multiple Recycling Starlings while accruing advantage and extending your plays. The decks augmented this strategy with the Tri-Brigade engine, an archetype based around the Tri-types of Wing Beast, Beast, and Beast Warrior monsters. Lyrilusc combined well with this archetype as Tri-Brigade Nerval. The main deck Wing Beast of the Tri-Brigades was a level 1 Wing Beast monster that was easily searched by Lyrilusc and can then search the rest of the Tri-Brigade monsters or Lyrilusc with its graveyard effect. This effectively bridged the two archetypes together perfectly. Tri-Brigade gave Lyrilusc access to powerful link monsters like Tri-Brigade Shirag the Ominous Omen to increase the deck's going second power and grind game. It also gave Lyrilusc easy access to Simorgh, Bird of Sovereignty, which catapulted the deck's going first healing by being able to summon an Omni-Negate like Mist Valley Apex Avian or a powerful Floodgate like Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds. Bird Up was one of the best decks from 2021 coming into 2022. It kicked off the year with a win of the most competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments known as the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series, or YCS for short. Kamal won one of the first YCS of the season with Bird Up in the remote dual North American YCS in mid-January. Bird Up was poised to be one of the strongest decks in the meta for some time, but unfortunately was one of the worst victims of this year's ban list. Not only did the deck lose Simorgh, Bird of Sovereignty to the ban list, but it also had Lyrilusc Recycling Starling limited to 1, which both shrunk the deck's ability to extend, and also made the deck's ability to make Draco Future way too costly and inconsistent. These bans ultimately scuttled Bird Up as a viable strategy for the rest of the year, but it still won a YCS early on, and was one of the most powerful decks in the format before those bans, letting it just squeak in our number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Exosisters. Exosisters is a classic example of an effective anti-meta deck. Its core strategy revolves around preventing your opponent from special summoning from the graveyard or heavily punishing them for doing so. The archetype got its first wave of cards in January 2022 in Grand Creators, but wouldn't really have a powerful enough core strategy to be a threat until the later support released. Of note is the archetype's main X-Deck boss monster, Exosisters Magnifica, which didn't come out until May with Dimension Force, as well as the deck's best starter, Exosister Martha, which came out in August with the blockbuster set Power of the Elements. Exosisters had a hard road to relevance, having its best piece of support with Martha being released alongside dominant metagame strategies like Spright and Tearlaments and Power of the Elements. But that also might have been the deck's saving grace. Both Spright and Tearlaments especially, have effects that rely on the graveyard that Exosisters can specifically play against. With its core extra deck monsters like Exosisters Magnifica and Exosister Michaelis supported by incredibly powerful tech cards like Dimension Shifter, Exosisters could actually put up a fight against these dominant archetypes. Exosisters found its way to being a solid anti-meta call for anyone who wasn't interested in playing Spright or Tearlaments. This let the deck survive and somewhat thrive in a very powerful metagame that many other powerful decks, even ones that will appear later on this list, couldn't keep up with. Exosisters' best showing was taking first place in the second Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship tournament after the release of Power of the Elements, winning YCS Niagara Falls, piloted by Raymond in a field otherwise dominated by Spright and Tearlaments. While its impact would lessen as more support for those other two archetypes came out later in the year, Exosisters struck at just the right time to make a solid impact on an incredibly powerful metagame, and that earns it the number 9 spot on this list. And at number 8, we have the Adventure Pile decks. This is a bit of a broader category, but you can largely classify this as a strategy that the Adventure Engine, also known as the Brave Engine, helped enable by working in combination with small, powerful, and most importantly, generic engines. The core of this deck is the Adventure Engine, which was released at the start of the year in January with the Grand Creator set. Adventure provided simple and consistent access to a powerful Omni-Negate effect with the Wandering Griffin Rider, an easy out to Floodgates with Dracoback the Red Bull Dragon, and a potential 4,000 life point swing with both Griffin and the Adventure token. And it did all of this with just one card, Right Devour Messir, which was easily searched with Water Enchantress at the Temple or a Foolish Burial sending Enchantress to the graveyard. It gave resiliency and damage reach to decks that could afford to sacrifice or ignore using an effect on their normal summon. It played especially well with other small engines that could also abuse all the free materials and the insulation from Nibiru the Primal Being that the token and Griffin Rider provided. This led to a rise of pile-style decks, where players would mash up several engines together to add some powerful grind game or heavy interaction on boards to the standalone power of Adventure. These decks would also break with traditional deck building principles by including up to 60 main deck cards to do so. Most notably was the Cyberse Eldritch and Base strategies. The base strategy was an acronym put together to stand for Brave, Artifacts, Souls, Enforcer, Dragons, which included Adventure, Tenyis, and Magician Souls as a way to accrue advantage and material before setting up an extra deck lock with Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer and Artifact Scythe, while also going into powerful single plays with Krishan Halgi Fibrax and Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon combos facilitated by the Tenyis. Similarly, the Cyberse Eldritch variant also ran Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer and Scythe setups, but didn't run the high power of the Tenyi synchro combos, instead relying on the advantage of the grind game of Eldritch and the easy link combo potential of Cyberse Gadget to enable the Artifact Dagda and Predaplant Verteanaconda. These adventure pile decks took tons of top spots in the earlier half of the year, with Paul winning the North American Remote Duel YCS of the Tenyi Focus variant. These decks likely played a large part in why powerful cards like Predaplant Verteanaconda and Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon issued bans partway through the year, which is a good sign of just how good these decks could be. And at number 7, we have Adventure Prank Kids. Adventure Prank Kids is another adventure-style deck, but it functions distinct from the pile concept in the previous entry because they weren't necessarily going that far above the usual 40-card deck. These Adventure Prank Kids decks abuse the inherent one-card combo with Prank Kids, along with the fact that none of the Prank Kids needed to use their effects on normal summon, allowing the Prank Kid archetype to work perfectly with the Adventure engine. While the Prank Kid combos itself didn't have as high as a ceiling as a pile variant, it was incredibly consistent, played well over the course of multiple turns, and could fit in a ton of hand traps in a smaller list. This gave it a lot more bang for its buck out of its hand traps, while also giving the deck a higher impact out of its side deck, as you're more likely to see your Silver Bullet side deck cards in a smaller 40-card list compared to 60 cards. The main strategy of the deck was to set up the Adventure line to gain the Wandering Griffin Rider Omni-Negate, then employ the one-card Prank Kids combo with any Prank Kid to get out Prank Kids Battle Butler that can destroy all of your opponent's monsters twice on their turn, thanks to having access to Prank Kids Meow Meow Mew, and use any leftover materials to set up Predaplant Verteanaconda to make Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. These two work together so well because Prank Kids famously has a lot of issues losing to its first Prank Kid trigger being hand-trapped, something that Wandering Griffin Rider could prevent. Combine that with a powerful hand trap lineup and you have the makings of the best performing deck of the Adventure dominant format earlier this year. While the deck couldn't put up a board as absurd as base with its Tenyi synchro combos and its grind game was only comparable to Eldritch variant, the fact that it achieved a middle ground in power level while only needing 40 cards helped it just edge out these other variants of Adventure decks. Adventure Prank Kid's best showing was Elijah's win in the YCS Charlotte, and the deck might have seen more success after that, but within a month of that win, Prank Kid's Meow Meow Mew was banned on the May ban list, alongside other stable generic payoff cards like Predaplant Verteanaconda. This completely took the teeth out of the Prank Kid style adventure decks, but they still made a huge impact on the year during their time in the spotlight. And at number 6, we have Mystic Mine. While Mystic Mine isn't typically considered an archetype or standalone strategy, it's impossible to look at the metagame of 2022 without noting just how big of an impact not only Mystic Mine had as a standalone card, but also as the core winning strategy in different decks. Mystic Mine is arguably the most powerful floodgate in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. As properly employed, it turns off all monster-centric strategies. And outside of Mystic Mine decks in particular, nearly every deck is centered around monster effects. The Mystic Mine-centric engine, if you can call it an engine, revolves around 3 Mystic Mine and 1 Terraforming, but the main thing that set apart Mystic Mine-centered decks from other decks that just use Mystic Mine as a tech option were the cards Metaverse and Demise of the Land. These two cards have the ability to not only get Mystic Mine, but to set Mystic Mine up on your opponent's turn, even if they found one of their few main deck outs or side deck outs to your first Mystic Mine. The main 2 decks that saw success with this strategy were Sky Striker and Burn. Sky Striker is a deck that has an on-again, off-again success over the years across multiple formats because of just how solid the archetype is as a control deck. It's been slowly power creeped over time after the ban list and limitations to the archetype weakened it, but few things in the game can power creep Mystic Mine. And we saw that on full display at YCS Hartford when Poe took first place behind the combination of Mystic Mine Core and Sky Striker. Sky Striker brought along a ton of strong going second tools and draw power to help get mine, but more importantly had easy access to single monsters that could attack directly with Sky Striker Ace Hayate. So long as your opponent was stuck with 2 more monsters under Mystic Mine, Hayate could slowly peck away their life points to secure a victory. But Sky Striker wasn't the only Mystic Mine deck to win a YCS. In the YCS directly after Hartford, Mystic Mine earned a second win with a burn-centric strategy piloted by yugioh at YCS Rio de Janeiro. He employed an Ojama Duo and Ojama Trio alongside the Floodgates, Rivalry of the Warlords, and Gozen match to keep his opponent locked under Mystic Mine, and would then win the game with Cauldron of the Old Man, burn your opponent over multiple turns. While the Sky Striker and Burn decks undoubtedly had different playstyles, they both share this core strategy of floodgating your opponent out of the game with Mystic Mine and attacking their opponent's life points slowly over multiple turns to clinch victory. Though it came later in the year after these wins, Mystic Mine was finally banned in the December ban list, putting a stop to any deck like these in the future, winning with Yu-Gi-Oh's most notorious Floodgate. And coming in at number 5, we have Floowandereeze. Floowandereeze is a deck revolving around multiple normal summons of winged beast monsters like Floowandereeze and Robina, and Floowandereeze and Eaglin that can very quickly set up powerful floodgates like Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds and Floowandereeze and Empem. These floodgates are backed up by other powerful disruptions like their field spell, Floowandereeze and the Magnificent Map, or their trap card, Floowandereeze and Dreaming Town, which allow them to employ their chain normal summoning strategy to summon on their opponent's turn to use the effects of cards like Rise of the Mega Monarch and Mist Valley Apex Avian as further disruption. Floowandereeze also has a distinction of being the best deck that can run Dimensional Shifter, an incredibly oppressive hand trap that sets up a lingering floodgate style effect to banish any card that would go to the graveyard. On top of that, all the Floowandereeze monsters banish themselves upon leaving the field, but return to your hand when you normal summon a Winged Beast, giving the deck a practically infinite resource loop. The interesting thing about Floowandereeze is how consistent a presence it is in the metagame. It is the only deck that has been relevant in every single format from the beginning of the year to the end, as it has a respectable game plan against nearly any deck due to the floodgate style nature of its engine. It's never really considered the best deck in any of these formats, but can be considered as good as maybe the second best deck at times thanks to its decent tier limit matchup, or somewhere around the third to fifth best deck at other points in the year. Floowandereeze has the habit of always being the bridesmaid and never the bride, as throughout the year it had multiple appearances and very high top cuts, but could never clinch a YCS victory outside of being one of the 3 winning decks of the 3v3 YCS Quito. That said, in the very next YCS at Minneapolis, it took second place. It then took another second place at YCS Dortmund, and at the height of the Ishizu Tearlaments dominance of the format. The World Championship qualifier circuit was a bit kinder to Floowandereeze, as it did earn some victories there. It took first place in the Central America WCQ, the Italy YCQ, and the Spain YCQ. Floowandereeze has been a staple of the metagame for the entire year, and while it came up just short in the biggest tournaments, its non-stop presence and solid performance, no matter what the metagame entails, gives it a well-deserved spot on this list. And at number 4 on this list, we have Swordsoul Tenyi. This is a Synchro and Worm type focused archetype that relies on extreme consistency and mid-range style of gameplay. It could consistently put up a strong board with cards like Baron de Flor, Swordsoul Grandmaster Chizao, off of one card set up with Swordsoul Amoye, with any extra extenders increasing the board's power level with cards like Swordsoul Blackout or Draco Berserker the Tenyi. On top of that, it had incredibly powerful going second capabilities with high damage output, strong board breaking monsters like Braxia, Brightness of the Yangzing, and the Tenyi engine's strong going second capabilities to force interactions before committing to more powerful Swordsoul monsters. It even splashed in easy to use and generically powerful combo tools with Krishnan Haki Fibrax and Mecha Phantomies Auroradon combos, easily accessible thanks to cards like Tenyi Spirit Adhara. This gave the deck a higher ceiling and the ability to play through opposing hand traps. On top of that, it could search Arch Nemesis Protoss thanks to Swordsoul Emergence, granted this powerful mid-range deck a hyper-oppressive floodgate that only got better in games 2 and 3 once you knew what your opponent's deck was. Swordsoul Tenyi has a distinction of being the first best deck of 2022. It carried over into the year after being the best deck at the end of 2021, and immediately capitalized on that with an early win at the European Remote Duel YCS piloted by Simon. While you might have expected the deck to have been power crept by new strategies that released afterwards, like Adventure and Grand Creators or the branded Despia structure release, Swordsoul also got a late piece of support with Swordsoul Sinister Sovereign Queasing Longyong that was seemingly explicitly designed to give it a solid answer to cards like Fateful Adventure or the branded Fusion monsters. Despite more and more powerful decks and engines being released, Swordsoul was very similar to Floowandereeze, in the sense that it stuck to the meta for months despite the power creep. Even with the early ban of Arch Nemesis Protoss after its YCS win, the deck continued to see a presence in top cuts thanks to how resilient and solid it was. It would even adjust to certain metas, including cards like Rival of the Warlords as a powerful floodgate to help it compete with branded Despia strategies after Protoss was banned. And while it may have less YCS wins compared to the aforementioned Mystic Mind strategies, it does make up for it with an impressive series of wins across the World Championship qualifier season. It won the North American WCQ, the Netherlands WCQ, the Panama WCQ, the Slovenia WCQ, and finally the Sweden WCQ. While these tournaments aren't considered as challenging or prestigious as larger YCS tournaments, that's still an inspiring list of tournament wins for Swordsoul Tenyi, despite its most powerful card having been banned months before the WCQ season, more than earning its spot at number 4 on this list. And at number 3 on this list, we have Branded Despia. Branded Despia is a fusion-centric archetype revolving around Fallen of Albaz and the corrupted Dogmatica monsters, known as Despia, creating powerful boss monsters like Mirajade the Iceblade Dragon or Guardian Chimera. The deck's notable for the incredible one-card combo power Branded Fusion, a fusion spell that fuses monsters from the main deck, which was easily searchable by Aluber, the Jester of Despia, itself being searchable by Branded Opening. This powerful one-card setup will get access to both Mirajade and Branded in Red, on top of the deck have an incredible, powerful recursive resource engine, with cards like Despian Tragedy and Ad Libitum of the Despia. The full power of Branded Despia came together partway through the year with the release of the Albaz Strike Structure deck in April, and would immediately take the spot as the top deck of the format. Even had room for odd variants, as some players chose to splash the Adventure engine or even Eldritch variants to the deck to some success. though the regular branded Despia version, often with a small edge imp and Fright Fur Splash to gain access to Fright Fur Patchwork, was the most popular and successful. The Adventure Pile and Swordsoul Tenyi decks, while still competitive, took a backseat as branded Despia immediately routed off 2 YCS wins. The first was YCS Bogeta, and the second was YCS Guadalajara. Branded Despia remained undoubtedly the top dog of the format going into the World Championship qualifiers, as well, even outperforming Swordsoul Tenyi's 5 WCQ wins, with 6 of its own. WCQ South America was won on an Eldlinge variant, WCQ Denmark was won with an Adventure variant, WCQ Austria, WCQ Colombia, WCQ Guatemala, and WC Portugal were all won with a standard version. An outstanding list of victories for such a dominant deck. Oddly enough, unlike previous entries in this list, branded Despia never received any major hits to it on the ban list. What really pushed it out of its spot of the meta dominant force was a pair of other decks released in late 2022. And with number 2 on this list, we have Spright. Spright was released in August of 2022 in the Power of the Elements alongside Tearlaments. These 2 decks immediately warped the metagame due to their power level. Every deck except a couple of anti-meta strategies overnight became obsolete with Power of the Elements release because of just how powerful a deck like Spright was. It even had a brief stint of tier 0 status over the OCG, though in the TCG, Tearlament had a strong enough showing to prevent that outcome. Spright is a deck built around level, rank, and Link 2 monsters, even being able to cheat summoning conditions with cards like Gigantic Spright, which could use a Link 2 monster as an Xyz material in place of a level 2. Spright as a standalone archetype is one of the most powerful and consistent decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. It has some of the most pushed combo starters ever, seen with an in-archetype emergency teleport style card with Spright Starter, as well as Spright Jet, which can search it, and Spright Blue, which can search Jet or any other Spright monster. The Spright monsters that aren't advantage occurring starters end up being powerful main deck disruption cards, like Spright Red, which comes with the built-in monster negate, Spright Carrot, which has a spell and trap negate, and Spright Pixies, which shores up the deck's only real weakness by dominating the battle phase. Each of these monsters can special summon themselves so long as you control a level, link, or rank 2 monster on the field, meaning the entire archetype functions as extenders. Because of this fact, Spright's notable for just how many incredibly strong tech options and secondary engines it can play. We even have an entire top 10 video dedicated to Spright techs if you want more info on that. The most relevant ones competitively would start with Runick, an engine that skips Spright's biggest weakness in the battle phase to employ an impressive card advantage and control engine while summoning a level 2 fusion monster. Next is the incredible robust Frog engine, which gives Spright access to a powerful starter and Swap Frog, an even more powerful extender in Rodent Totem, and a great boss monster with Totally Awesome. Next is Tri-Brigade engines thanks to Tri-Brigade Karas and Tri-Brigade Kit both being level 2. Finally, and maybe most interesting of all, Tearlaments themselves work well with Spright as one of their core monsters. Tearlaments merely was level 2. Meaning an end-board monster like Spright Elf could get you access to an entire Tearlaments combo lineup on your opponent's turn by summoning merely. Spright was a huge paradigm shift when it came to power, consistency, and the ability to weave in older engines. While it came in too late to make much of a splash in the WCQ season, the deck had huge success in YCSs, winning 3 straight. The first was YCS Ultridge, piloted by Joshua with a Runick Spright variant. Then it was one of the 3 decks during the 3v3 YCS Quinto, piloted by Gerardo, with the Tri-Brigade variant. And lastly, it won YCS Minneapolis, piloted by Christopher, with the Tearlament variant. The only thing that kept the deck from even more dominance was the Mystic Mind decks taking the first 2 YCSs after the release of Spright, while the meta was still new. But even in those tournaments, it was taking large chunks of the top cut despite not winning outright. Spright is one of the most dominant decks in history, a masterclass in power creep, and it might have been even tier 0 status instead of tier 1, if not for one other deck. And finally, the number 1 on our list, we have Tearlaments, most notably Ishizu Tearlament, though Tearlament was seeing plenty of success before the release of the Ishizu cards. As mentioned previously, Tearlaments were released alongside Spright in the Power of the Elements pack in August. Tearlaments are a fusion-based archetype that revolve around milling cards from the deck and triggering their effects to fuse with cards in the graveyard whenever a Tearlament monster is milled. Being able to, as part of the core mechanic of the deck, fill up your graveyard with tons of material is incredibly powerful. Cards like that Grassleg Screener are banned for the potential to mill upwards of 20 cards, and Tearlaments would frequently mill that many cards on their first turn to sub their fusion plays without having to run a 60-card deck. This would let the deck take advantage of other powerful graveyard synergies and enablers, most notably cards like Fairy Tale Snow, which was unbanned prior to Tearlament's release, gave tons of extra special summons and free disruption on your opponent's turn when milled. Snow was quickly rebanned in October, but Tearlaments was still incredibly powerful in spite of that. The deck can also strongly abuse other mill-centric cards like Curious to set up specific Tearlaments fusions or graveyard synergies. Tearlaments also marks a huge step forward in power creep, with cards like Tearlaments Havness, which functions similar to a hand trap, but instead of being a targeted piece of disruption, Havness just begins the Tearlament combo lines on your opponent's turn. Much like Spright, TCG players found plenty of secondary engines to run in combination with Tearlaments to maximize their capabilities. Aside from the already mentioned combination with Spright, it most notably made use of Dangers thanks to Danger Nessie's Aqua typing working well with the fusion requirements for a card like Tearlaments Kid Kalos and Tearlaments Kaleidoheart. Dangers also incidentally discarded Tearlament monsters for their graveyard effects while providing link materials on the board and draw power. So even worse Danger monsters like Danger Mothman saw plenty at play. Tearlaments in this Danger iteration would see some success, being piloted by one of the 3 winning decks in YCS Quito. And the Spright Tearlaments variation of the deck would win YCS Minneapolis. The WCQ season was almost done, but it even won the most recent WCQ Oceania. While this level of success would have earned Tearlaments a high spot on this list, that's not even the tip of the iceberg. What really pushed Tearlaments over the edge was the release of the Ishizu retrain cards based on Keldo, Mudora, Kelbeck, and Agido. These cards all had powerful effects upon being milled, either allowing you to shuffle cards from either graveyard back into the deck or mill 5 more cards, both of which were incredibly powerful effects for Tearlaments to have access to with their self-mill strategy. These effects were so powerful that even the Bystials, an archetype of anti-graveyard hand traps that have effects that explicitly counter Tearlaments, couldn't keep up with Tearlaments when supported by Ishizu's monsters. Instead, Tearlament players just played them as well. This would lead to the first Tier 0 format in TCG since the dominance of Spiral 5 years ago in 2017. While not taking quite as much of every top cut as the same Tier 0 decks like Zodiac and Spirals at their peak, Ishizu Tearlaments was cleanly getting over 70% of top cuts in major tournaments in spite of other powerful decks like Spright, Floowandereeze, and branded Despia existing to contest it. Ishizu Tearlament mirrors were frequently exhibited during feature matches and top 8s. Since the Ishizu support was released, Tearlaments has won every major tournament, taking 3 straight YCS victories. Combined with the pre-Ishizu wins at Quito and Minneapolis, Tearlaments has won 5 straight YCSs. All this to say, Tearlaments is the well-deserved winner of the #1 spot on this list of the best deck of 2022, and it wasn't particularly close. Alright, and that's the list. Were there any other decks from 2022 that you think deserve a mention? Do you have any ideas for other Yu-Gi-Oh topics you'd like me to cover? If so, please leave a comment down below.